One term that you're going to see Wollstonecraft using quite a lot in this Vindication is the term education. And when we think of education from our present-day vantage point, most of the time what we have in mind is some sort of formal academic process, the sort of thing that happens in a school. So, we often distinguish between education and training. If you go to a karate class, it's not part of your education. You're being trained in karate. If you go to pottery, whatever, where you fire up pottery and, paint on it with the glazes and put it in the kiln and do that sort of thing, we don't think of that as really education, or we call that continuing education, because the idea of the paradigm for education is pre-K, or, that's if you're lucky enough to have pre-K, K through 12, and then perhaps college or a vocational school or something like that. Wollstonecraft means something much broader by education, namely any sort of training the person, providing them with general ideas about how things work, what they ought to do, where they fit into society. All of that is part of a broader education. And what it depends on, she talks about this in chapter 6, is what we call the association of ideas. And this is not an idea that she came up with on her own. It's something that's kind of floating around out there at the time. There's other people talking about this. But she's saying that this plays a very important role in how we understand the relations between men and women and their places in society. So she talks about the association of ideas either being habitual or instantaneous, and she says, I'm more interested in the habitual stuff, the things that happen over time because of the repeated actions that we do, or the repeated situations, or the continuing institutions, all that sort of stuff. And she says, education supplies the people of genius, and that's very rare, with knowledge to give variety and contrast. But there's also a habitual association of ideas that grows with our growth, which has a great effect on the moral character of mankind. So she says, and by which a turn is given to the mind that commonly remains through life. So the ways in which we come to understand how we should look at people is a matter of education. What we often call prejudice is an issue of education as well. So, we could think about prejudice in terms of ethnicity or race. We could think about it in terms of, religion. We could think about it in terms of class. Sometimes people who are raised in an environment of great, privilege don't understand what it's like for other people, and they may view them as their natural inferiors. That's part of what they're gaining from education in this sense, the association of ideas. You see people constantly being mistreated, you probably think, well, maybe they have it coming to them, or that's what we ought to do. It can also take effect, and it does, according to Wollstonecraft, in terms of gender. She goes on and she says, so ductile is the understanding, and yet so stubborn, that the associations which depend on adventitious circumstances during the period that the body takes to arrive at maturity can seldom be disentangled by reason. So, what's boiled down into more simple terms? Our childhood screw us up. There's all sorts of things where we drew the wrong lesson from what we observed or what somebody told us. And once we get these ideas fixed in our heads because of associating that way, it's hard to get rid of them. This can extend to things as innocent as what kind of food you like because you grew up with that. It's harder to make healthy food choices if your parents don't feed you well. Another great example that's a little bit, well, it's not really innocent, and the food choices isn't either, but one of the best predictors for whether a child is going to go on to become a person who reads turns out to be not just whether their parents read or read to them, but whether they actually see their parents enjoying the act of reading on their own, not just reading out of a sense of duty, but reading because they want to. Children who observe that sort of thing catch it. but they don't catch it by, like the way we do with diseases, with organisms. It's rather through the association that happens over and over and over again, and it becomes part of our character. So she says, one idea calls up another, its old associate, and memory, faithful to the first impressions, particularly when intellectual powers are not employed to cool our sensations, retraces them with mechanical exactness. There's a kind of mechanism, a kind of automaticity involved in this. And you can see this with people who have fears and they're not quite sure where these fears are coming from. And it turns out that maybe somebody punished them at this time for something associated with this. Or it's just something just bad happened. That nobody had any control over it, and ideas were associated. So she calls this a habitual slavery to first impressions. And she says it has a more baneful effect on the female than the male character. Why? Because business and other dry employments of the understanding tend to deaden the feelings and break associations that do violence to reason. So if you're having to be in the workplace, and you're in a workplace where if you don't do your job right, you're going to get fired, you have to rely on your faculty of reason to some degree. And if you're a what we call a hot mess, because you've got weird associations of ideas, either reason is going to break them or you're not going to last in the workplace. But if you have an environment in which things are a little bit more sheltered, and you can think about this with respect to the people who enjoy certain privilege, they can be quite sheltered as well. There isn't that impetus to deal with the weird things that associations have done to us. So she says, everything that people see or hear serves to fix impressions, call forth emotions, and associate ideas. She calls this, for women, the cruel association of ideas which everything conspires to twist into all their habits of thinking, or to speak with more precision of feeling, receives new force when they start to act a little for themselves. Why? Because once a habit of mind and action and emotion has been set like that, the person will tend to act in such a way as to place themselves in situations where it's going to get reinforced. They feel like they're actually being free, but they're actually binding themselves even more to habit through this force of education. So we want to pay close attention to that. Now you notice I've got the board divided up into three things. One is a sort of critique of what's going on in the education of women according to Wollstonecraft, and we'll go into that in a bit of detail. And this is a cycle, a vicious cycle that goes into society and perpetuates itself. And this is part of what she's trying to break the cycle of. But first we want to look at this. Education, where does it actually happen? So she's got this great discussion about several of these. We talked about association of ideas already. This can happen through, individuals in their experiences. They start to draw conclusions. Usually we're drawing conclusions from insufficient data, so we can, get ourselves into all sorts of muddles that way. The remedy for that is to have better information, to exercise our faculties of reason, to become critical thinkers, as we call it, to develop some of the virtues that we need. So that's a possibility. Now she says, by individual education, I mean, for the sense of the word is not precisely defined, such an attention to a child as will slowly sharpen the senses, form the temper, regulate the passions as they begin to ferment, and set the understanding to work before the body arrives at maturity. Now, she also says, to prevent any misconstruction, I must add, I do not believe that a private education can work the wonders which some sanguine writers have attributed to it. What does she mean by a private education there? Does she just mean homeschooling? No, she would also include what we call public education by that. The education where it's being done in a sort of deliberate manner by people who are supposed to be educators, who are supposed to be, focusing on how do we develop the child's mind, all that sort of stuff. Now, how exactly she would evaluate our current education system, that's an interesting question which we can explore a little bit later. What about society itself? Doesn't society teach us lessons? A lot of times people want to say, oh, the media, that's what's to blame. We got to watch out for the music or the video games or the television or the celebrities. And that's part of what she's talking about there. But it's also the governmental institutions. It's also the general ways in which we think about things. That educates us. She says, men and women must be educated in a great degree by the opinions and the manners of the society they live in. We're tempted to think that we're more independent in our thinking of society than we really are. We're actually influenced quite a bit by our fellow creatures. It takes a lot to go against prevailing public opinion and to say, no, I believe this and I'm going to hold to this belief. Very often when people do that sort of thing, they do it in such a way that actually screws them up in other ways, just out of obstinacy or stubbornness or cantankerousness. But most people sort of get along to go along, and they do so in the realm of knowledge. She says, in every age there has been a stream of popular opinion that has carried all before it and given a family character, as it were, to the century. Isn't that an interesting phrase? A family character, as it were, to the century. What does she mean by that? Well, think about how families are. Families, they may have tensions within them, and I know, teenagers are supposed to rebel against their parents, but, that's a recent thing. A lot of teenagers don't rebel against their parents, and even the ones that do rebel, often, by the time that they're 30, 40, they say two things. One is, wow, mom and dad, this is if they were good parents, mom and dad actually knew what the hell they were doing. They were right about this, that, and the other. The other thing that they often say, whether the parents were good parents or bad parents, is, wow, I'm my dad, or I'm my mom. I'm saying and doing the same sort of stuff that they were doing at their age. Now I understand how they felt. Why does that happen? Well, because these kind of mindsets tend to replicate themselves from generation to generation. So when she's talking about a family character to the age, what she means is that we're like one big family, and we tend to repeat the same ideas and opinions back and forth to each other. You could associate this with cultures. For example, in the United States, we like to give a lot of lip service to freedom. If we really look at things in a careful way, and we try to be consistent about stuff, we find out we have much less freedom than we think that we do, and we probably also have a lot less of other things than we think that we do. But we give a lot of, good talk to freedom. Freedom's a good thing, as much freedom as possible. And, where do people tend to disagree? Well, that freedom is interfering with this freedom over here. So, on the right, they have the, freedom to engage in economic enterprise. On the left, maybe the freedom to, get an abortion or something like that, right? Freedom of speech on both sides, unless the other person is saying something. And when it comes down to it, nobody's actually saying, well, why is freedom a good thing? How do you know you got that right? There are a few people who are actually saying that, but they tend not to be in the mainstream. There are certain basic cultural assumptions that are built into the mainstream society, and it depends on the era, it depends on the culture, it depends to a certain degree on class and things like that. But we imbibe that, we learn that from the places that we live. So she says, it can be fairly inferred, unless society be differently constituted, much cannot be dependent or expected from education. As long as you're not actually changing the society and changing its basic assumptions and its structures, you can educate however you like. You can tell, here's a great example, you can tell every kid in your civics class, any one of you can be president, but you're really, making something up there. Not all of them could be president, not in the current, situation that we have. First, you got to align yourself with one of the two parties. That's a whole can of worms right there. You got to do a lot of selling of yourself, and sometimes even selling out of yourself. And you better not get a criminal record. And you better, do this, and you better do that. Not everybody is going to be up to that. And even if they did, they're not going to necessarily win. Most of us can't run for president. And that's because of the way society is structured. So if you go and you tell your students, I believe in every one of you, you know, society is going to tell them a different message, and society is probably going to beat you, the educator, to that. So it's kind of pessimistic to think about that, isn't it? Why are we doing what we're doing here, if that's the case? Now, she also talks about the importance of profession. Professional classes and the professions that individuals engage in are a lot of what shapes their mindset, a lot of what shapes their character. You know, if you think about it, work is where you do a lot of your thinking and a lot of your living in you know, whatever setting you happen to be in. And if you're out of work, you know, it's sitting around at home, which ends up being your way of life or your job, or maybe you do volunteering. But whatever it is that you're committed to as a vocation, that shapes you. That gives you certain assumptions. So you don't see the world the same way as other people do. She's very down on professional soldiers. She might not say the same thing about military people in our day, where things are a bit different. But the professional soldiers in her time tended to be guys that hung out in the barracks and got in trouble around town and spent a lot of their time drinking and dueling and playing dice and playing cards and talking up a storm and trying to seduce the local women and, you know, in general, doing the sort of things that soldiers have done. And they didn't develop good character as a result. She's even, you know, more down on sailors because of some other reasons that I won't go into. But, you know, you can figure out, I think, on your own. But you know, whatever profession we go into, it's going to have some effects on us. The job or the career demands a certain mindset from us if we're actually going to be able to do it. So she will say, you know, the human character has never been formed by the employments the individual or class pursues. And if the faculties are not sharpened by necessity, they must remain obtuse. Now, how does this apply to women? She's going to say also, it's of great importance to observe that the character of every man is in some degree formed by his profession. A man of sense may only have a cast of countenance that wears off as he traces individuality, whereas the weak, common man has scarcely ever any character but what belongs to the body. At least all his opinions have been so steeped in the vat consecrated by authority that the faint spirit which the grape of his own vine yields cannot be distinguished. The idea is that some people become their job. They're unable to really think outside of it. That's because education is happening there. It could be stultifying education, it could be ennobling education, but education is in fact taking place. So if you're stuck in some dead-end job, you know, what we call a soul-crushing job, that could actually be bad for your mind as well as bad for your spirit and your body, according to Wollstonecraft. How do women stand with respect to professions? Well, she tells us something here. She says, the argument may be extended to women, seldom occupied by serious business, as women who can actually afford to be so. The pursuit of pleasure gives that insignificancy to their character which renders the society of the great so insipid. She actually will draw a connection between women who are confined to the domestic sphere and men and women who belong to the upper classes. They don't develop, in her view, a lot of character because they don't have to. They're not forced to, and they are poorly educated in this respect as a result. The other thing that she points out is women, for the most part, are stuck with just one profession, being what we call homemakers. Or the alternate side of that is being marriageable, you know, as they used to call it, going to college to get your MRS degree. Well, you know, what does that do? That means that they're not going to be involved in any sort of profession which is going to expand their minds and introduce them to new ideas. So their education is going to suffer as a result. We're also educated very much by our family life. She has a lot of examples here about what goes on within families where, you know, girls are getting very definite messages about how much they matter, what sort of life is expected of them, how they can have whatever degree of power or control that they're going to have, namely through beauty and attractiveness and manipulating men. There's a lot that's going on there, and a lot of these lessons are not coming through explicit, let me sit you down here, I'm going to have a talk with you kind of lessons. They're coming through the examples set by the parents, the ways in which men and women interact with each other within the matrix of the family. So if you've got a family in which things are set up in a very patriarchal way, the man has all the power, whether it's authority, spending power, social power, and the woman is kept subservient, that woman's daughters observing that are going to come to see that as sort of a natural condition to be looked for when they end up, marrying, or perhaps they'll react against it if they're a Wollstonecraft. So what does Wollstonecraft say? She says the first care of mothers or fathers who really attend to the education of females should be that they should take care of their daughters' minds. And they should also, if not to strengthen the body, at least not destroy the constitution by mistaken notions of beauty and female excellence. This is something quite interesting as well. Putting on makeup is, from Wollstonecraft's perspective, a matter of education. When do girls put on makeup? What do they need to do in order to be presentable? Back in her time, this included using a lot of things that were pretty detrimental to health, but we still have things like that going on today. Think about the messages. Great example here of bad education that's very detrimental to women, more detrimental to women than to men. I know that there are some men that applies to, but more to women. Think about anorexia as something that plagues our society, particularly with teenage girls. Where are they getting the message that they should starve themselves? It's not a natural thing to do. You actually have to go very strongly against our natural urges that we have as animals in order to do that. Well, what kind of images are they getting of women in society? There's been a lot of discussion about this with models. Models are, in fact, too skinny. And then they're photoshopped to make them look even skinnier. But they can be getting this also from family life. They can be getting an undue emphasis. Families that have eating disorders tend to produce children who have other eating disorders, who pass them on to their children. When people have these associations of ideas that they've gotten through some sort of education that end up causing them a lot of travail and a lot of pain, they are not they're not something that just stays with them. They get passed on to the rest of the family. There's an education that takes place. So all of these are ways in which women are getting educated. What else does Wollstonecraft tell us about that? What should an education actually be like? If women are being miseducated, what kind of education should they have? By the way, she thinks that most men are miseducated in this respect too. Education is bearing not just on, like we said, information, but also on practical matters. How we decide what's good and bad, whether we develop virtues and vices, how we should evaluate our relationships, how we should plan our lives, what prospects we should imagine for ourselves, how we visualize, where we're going to be 20 years from now. All that's a matter of education. So what should education do? It should exercise the intellect. It should develop our mental capacities. This is why traditional education has included some of the subjects that it does. Reading, writing, arithmetic, the 3 R's, right? Arithmetic, mathematics. Why do you need those? Well, if you want to make it in this society, particularly in a society of the internet, you got to be able to read and you got to be able to write. Literacy is very important. Numeracy is very important. Social studies. Why do we have children do this, sort of vaguely defined field of social studies, which includes everything from civics to history to psychology? Because you want to understand how human beings work and what's been going on in the past and where we might be going. Science. Why do we have science education? It expands the mind. It actually teaches you at least something about chemistry and biology and, how to fuse these things together in fields like earth science or environmental science, these kind of hybrid fields. As our world becomes more and more and more technological, the math and science becomes more and more vital to educate both men and women about, to exercise their intellect. Music exercises the intellect. Art exercises the intellect. Those are not just, mushy-gushy, fun time kind of classes. If they're being done well, they teach you how to perceive color, how to understand how things come together in terms of design. Music has a lot of mathematics involved in musical theory, to learn how to harmonize and what dissonance is. Those are vital things. Education should also strengthen the body. Wollstonecraft would probably be for having phys ed classes, so long as it's not just teaching bullying, but actually teaching some valuable skills and strengthening the body. She also talks about the need to form the heart. And here she talks about attaining virtue. A genuine education doesn't just provide us with information. It steers us towards becoming our better selves, towards realizing human nature, towards developing and understanding traits like honesty, justice, temperance or moderation, gentleness. These sorts of things are supposed to be what a human being ought to have, and that is part of what makes us independent. This is really central. A genuine education in Wollstonecraft's mind is supposed to gear us towards a state of independence. It's not supposed to simply get us ready for the workplace. It's supposed to make us people who can choose what kind of job we're going to have and who might be able to negotiate with an employer about that sort of thing. Who also might be able to say, this job isn't for me. Now what happens? What happens instead? Women's education, she says, and again, she doesn't have in mind, what's going on in K through 12. She has in mind what's going on in all these other dimensions. Women's education focuses on bodily accomplishments and attributes. It could be like, domestic things like learning how to cook or sew, but it also includes how to make yourself attractive to men, how to be pleasing to the males. Oftentimes, she says, it's not even good for the body because of this undue emphasis on beauty or attractiveness. There's a lot of sacrifices that get made. She's got some great examples of these. I'm actually going to read some of this just straight out because it's, such wonderful discussion. She says, throughout the whole animal kingdom, every young creature requires almost continual exercise. The infancy of children should be passed in harmless gambols that exercise the feet and hands without requiring very minute direction from the head or the constant attention of a nurse. In fact, the care necessary for self-preservation is the first natural exercise of the understanding. Kids should be allowed to run and play and fall down and get themselves up and dust themselves off because that's how they learn. That's how they actually exercise the intellect. That's how they learn not to screw up in that way. Not to be precious little snowflakes that are going to get broken on every little, rough edge. She says, these wise designs of nature are counteracted by mistaken fondness or blind zeal. The child, she means the female child, is not left a moment to its own direction, and thus rendered dependent. Dependence is called natural. So to preserve personal beauty, the limbs and faculties are cramped with worse than Chinese bands. While the boys frolic in the open air, the girls have to sit inside. The girls play with dolls. Why? Because they're stuck with them, because that's the toys that they've got, and they're bored out of their minds. They're stuck hanging out with their moms. You know, a girl condemned to sit for hours together listening to the idle chat of weak nurses or to attend at her mother's toilet. Attend at her mother's toilet means sit there while her mom is putting on her face, while she's getting herself ready. Imagine a life spent like that. What sort of education are you getting? You're getting an education that has to do with just being charming with the body, not really enhancing the mind at all. So she goes on and she says that women are everywhere in this deplorable state. In order to preserve their innocence, as ignorance is courteously termed, truth is hidden from them. They're made to assume an artificial character before their faculties have acquired any strength. Taught from infancy that beauty is women's sceptre, the mind shapes itself to the body, roaming around its gilt cage only seeks to adorn its prison. Men have various employments and pursuits which engage their attention and give a character to the opening mind. Women confined to one profession, taking care of the desires of men, having their thoughts constantly directed to the most insignificant part of themselves, just their body, seldom extend their views beyond the triumph of the hour. This is a major problem. So she says, you know, it teaches women just to focus on pleasing men, keeps them in a condition of dependency. They're not being educated for anything better than that. If the only way that they can maintain themselves is by getting somebody else to like them, to think they're pretty, to think that they're valuable for that extent, that only extends to providing them the security of a dependent relationship. It also introduces rivalry between women that doesn't need to be there. Women see each other as competitors within that field when they don't need to be. And so what does it do? It keeps women from developing virtue or developing reason. And here we get the self-fulfilling cycle. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Men keep women in a position where they're going to be miseducated, where they're not, say, in the workplace, where they could learn, more. Particularly if they're in the workplace, they're not being allowed to get into better positions. They're learning a lot of mores from society, from the culture. And in family life, men aren't allowing the women to do very much there. So women become miseducated. What's the natural consequence of that? Bad thinking, since they haven't developed their intellectual capacities, because they weren't allowed to. Bad actions. Desires and passions that, make them seem flighty, make them seem trivial, make them seem perhaps dangerous and needing to be kept under some sort of control. But that's a natural consequence of miseducation. And then what do men do? Men draw the conclusion, well, women must be incapable. They must not be able to develop virtue. There must be something wrong with them. Maybe they're lesser than men. They have less capacities for virtue or for intellectual development. So what are we going to do then? We'll just keep the current system in place. And why bother throwing away good time educating women that obviously aren't going to do anything with it? Let's keep miseducating them. Let's keep the current system in place. And notice that Wollstonecraft is saying, even the good guys, even guys like Rousseau, who are all about the rights of human beings, are really only about the rights of one half of the human race, about the rights of men, not about the rights of women. This is why this is a vindication of the rights of women. One of the most fundamental rights is to a decent education.